All right, today we're jumping into a book from 1948 that is, believe me, seriously provocative. It's Richard M. Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. And it's this incredibly powerful and, yeah, for a lot of people, pretty controversial diagnosis of the modern world. He basically argues that all the problems we see around us, they're not new, they're the final act in a play that started a long, long time ago.
So let's get right into it. Weaver's big idea is this. Our society's issues, the moral confusion, the feeling that everything's falling apart, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, they have deep philosophical roots. These are ideas that took hold centuries ago and have been quietly shaping our world ever since, most of the time without us even noticing. And this is the central question, the real hook of his entire book. Could one single philosophical argument from way back in the 14th century, could that really be the domino that knocked over all the others, leading straight to our modern anxieties? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But Weaver's answer is a resounding yes, and we're going to follow that trail of breadcrumbs with him.
So here's our game plan for breaking down his argument. First, we're going to look at what he calls a decisive philosophical battle. Then, we'll trace the long chain of consequences that he says followed. After that, we'll get into the specific symptoms he saw in the world around him. Then we'll check out his wild metaphor for mass media, and finally, we'll unpack his ultimate warning.
Okay, so where does this all kick off? For Weaver, the whole story, the whole breakdown of the modern world, it starts with one single moment, a critical turning point. But it wasn't a war with swords and shields. It was a battle of ideas that, for him, completely changed the course of Western history. The battle was between two completely different ways of seeing reality itself. On one hand, you had realism. Realists believed that universal concepts, big ideas like humanity or justice or truth, were actually real things, existing out there, independent of our minds. But on the other hand, you had nominalism. Its big champion was a 14th century thinker named William of Ockham, and the nominalists said, no way, only individual particular things are real. That chair is real, that person is real. Those big universal concepts, they're just names. Nomina is the Latin word. They're just convenient labels we use to group things together. And you have to understand, Weaver isn't messing around here. He puts a massive amount of weight on this. He's not just describing some dusty old debate for a history class. He's claiming that the moment nominalism won that argument, it kicked off what he calls the dissolution of the West. For him, this was the first fatal step away from believing in an objective, universal truth. So how on earth does a medieval debate about ideas lead to, well, us, to the world we live in now? Weaver says it's because it started a chain reaction that lasted for centuries. It was a domino effect, where one idea knocked over the next and the next, leading us further and further away from where we started. And you can see that whole chain reaction laid out right here. It all starts in the 14th century with Ockham saying universals aren't real. Well, according to Weaver, that opens the door for empiricism a few centuries later. Thinkers like Hobbes and Locke start arguing that the only real knowledge is what you can see, touch, and measure. From there, it's a pretty short leap to 19th century materialism, where science, and especially Darwinism, explains humanity as just another product of nature, nothing special. In the end of the line, the final result in the 20th century, as Weaver puts it, and this is a really stark term, is the moral imbecile, a modern person who, having lost any connection to a higher truth, is just adrift.
Now, for Weaver, this whole philosophical journey didn't just stay in books and universities. He argued that you could actually see the effects, the symptoms all around you in modern society, creating a world that he saw as fundamentally broken and self-obsessed. So, here are some of the key symptoms he diagnosed. First, the fragmentation of knowledge. We replace the wise person who could connect different ideas with the narrow specialist, someone who knows absolutely everything about one tiny field, but has no big picture perspective. He says they live on the verge of psychosis. This also leads to an obsession with just collecting facts without ever asking what they mean. Then there's the rise of egotism. If there's no shared objective truth, what's left? Well, just me, my feelings, my desires. The individual becomes the center of the universe. And finally, if you reject universal ideas, you also reject the idea of natural hierarchy and distinction, which Weaver thought were crucial for a society to function properly.
No, this next part is kind of wild because, remember, Weaver was writing this way back in 1948, but his critique of mass media sounds like he could be talking about our world right now. He gave it this fantastic, poetic name, the Great Magic Lantern. So what is this great magic lantern? Well, for him, it was the entire media machine, the press, the movies, the radio. And he saw it as this giant projector that was constantly beaming a stream of carefully selected, sensational, and disconnected images at us. Its purpose wasn't to inform or to make us think. Its purpose was to distract and entertain, to keep us focused on a shallow, materialistic view of the world, and to stop us from ever having a moment of quiet reflection.
He argued this machine had three main arms. First up, the press. It creates this feeling of constant crisis and emergency, destroying what he called the deep conversation of culture. Then you have the cinema, which sells this shallow, materialistic dream of the good life, one that carefully avoids any real fundamental problems. And finally, the radio. He said it blasts us with a senseless, mechanical sequence of stuff, news, ads, music, mashing the important and the trivial all together until we can't really think or feel clearly about anything.
Okay, so all of this, the ancient philosophical shift, that long chain reaction, the symptoms in society, the role of the media, it's all building to Weaver's final and pretty intense warning about where this road ends. At the end of the day, Weaver's entire book really boils down to this one central claim. When a society gives up on the belief in transcendent objective truth, when it decides that concepts like justice and goodness are just words, it's essentially cutting itself off from its own foundations. It's like cutting the roots of a giant tree. Without that anchor, all you're left with is individual opinion, raw desire, and eventually, chaos.
And that really leaves us with a heavy thought to chew on. Weaver wrote all of this nearly 80 years ago, long before the internet, before social media, before 24-hour cable news. He was talking about newspapers and radio. Looking at our world today, drowning in an infinite sea of information, opinions, and alternative facts, his question feels more urgent than ever. Have ideas, in fact, had consequences? In a world where we have access to everything, have we somehow lost our shared sense of anything at all?